Hello. Thanks for coming to this talk. Thanks for GOTO for inviting me. Yeah, I've never been here before. Quite a nice venue. No one's looking from up the top, but that would be my spot if I was looking at this talk. It seems like a nice place up there. Anyways, it seems like all of you know more about modernization than me, so maybe we can get through the slides quickly and then you can tell me how to modernize. Let's start with the basic question. Why would any company want to modernize? If you're a successful company, why not keep building new features? And even if you personally understand why your company needs to modernize, this is what other people will be thinking. Why do we need to modernize? Why are all these tech people talking about modernization? I don't see any need for it. And if you're a successful company, there's a lot of reasons why you don't need to modernize, because IT is not always the differentiator. Having a better product doesn't always mean that you'll be the most successful company. You can have a worse product, but you can have a really strong brand reputation. If customers know your company and trust your company, they've been with you for 10 or 15 or 20 years, even longer in some cases, it might take a lot to get those customers to switch to a different product, even if the product is way better. And then there's other things here, like I would say lock-in and switching costs. When we think about lock-in, we often think about things like, I've got all of my data inside that company. If I move to another product, I have to move across all of my data. It's very technically difficult to do that. But lock-in is broader. Lock-in is almost on an organizational level, on a mindset level. When I worked for Salesforce, for example, Salesforce has all of these learning systems. They call it, I think it was Trailhead. You get all these badges. You're qualified in different areas of Salesforce. And if your company says, we're thinking of switching away from Salesforce, you're like, wait, I've got all these badges in Salesforce. I've built my career around Salesforce. You might not want to do that, even if there's a better product. And then Salesforce likes to do these big Dreamforce conferences every year. Oh, if we stop using Salesforce, we can't go to the big conferences anymore. So there's a lot of reasons why it's actually very difficult to switch away from a product, even if there are better products. But obviously, as we all know, having a worse product and a strong brand can help you in some situations. But in some industries, if you have a lot of legacy software and it's taking a long time to implement new features, you can be at a risk. It can be definitely a real disadvantage in your industry as smaller companies, newer companies start popping up. They're able to innovate faster, use the latest technologies, latest thinking in the industry, and you're stuck on old tech. That's a very big risk to your company. This is flickering, sorry. I covered all the points anyway. I'm just going to stand over here. So, good example of this is OpenTable. Around 10, 12 years ago, they were in a situation where they could see competitors in their industry were moving faster. And they decided we could keep building new products or we could modernize. My friend Orlando worked there. He explained some of the stories, 100 developers in the same code base, builds take a long time, compiles take a long time, merge conflicts, all those kind of things. They realized that they were in a serious position. They were under threat from competitors who were entering the industry. And they did a 9-month stop everything and modernize project. I don't normally recommend that, but that's how they did it. Normally it's a balance of new features and modernization. OpenTable did it the other way. But the key thing I would say for OpenTable is they recognized early there are new companies in our industry. They're innovating faster than us. If we don't do something now, we'll have a problem. Another reason for modernization is things just change even if you make good decisions. If you make perfect architecture decisions every day of your life, I'm sure lots of you make perfect decisions every day, but even if you make perfect decisions, something will change at some point and your system is no longer optimal. You build a system for one country, then you expand into other countries or you target different customers, and the system is not really designed for these things, but you have to make it support these things. A good example is a company called Vinted. They built a marketplace for selling women's clothing. They built a whole system for selling women's clothing. They became very successful at selling women's clothing, and they were like, well, let's sell some more things. But the system they built was designed to sell women's clothing, and their architecture was designed to sell women's clothing. So now they were having some difficulties adding new features because they were trying to do things that weren't women's clothing in a system that was designed for women's clothing, building it on top. See this all the time, really. It's a natural part of architecture, I think. You build the system for a certain set of use cases. You have to support other use cases. It's not really ideal, and over time, these compromises and wedged-in features become quite significant. So I would say architecture modernization, in my perspective, is for companies who are successful and established and have a strong brand reputation, maybe, but they also want the advantage of being able to innovate like smaller, fresher companies who don't have so much baggage and legacy. It's trying to have the best of both worlds, I would say. So in the rest of this talk, I'll cover 3 main topics. First one will be about what I think is the mindset, what we're trying to achieve with a modern architecture. Companies want to move quickly, build features faster, so we need to design an architecture that allows work to be implemented faster. That's the kind of equation, I think. Then I'll share with you some tools I find most effective, tools that are probably less commonly known. And then at the end, I'll talk about some of the key topics around change management, project management. You know, it's good to be able to design an architecture, but actually it's going to be a multi-year, unless you're open table, it's going to be a multi-year initiative with lots of things that can go wrong, lots of people trying to pull you in different directions, lots of ways modernization could fail. So what can you do to get started, break the inertia, and keep things moving? Very difficult challenge. So when I talk about architecting for flow, one of the things to think about here is we can't just focus on the tech side of things. If you took your current system and it's built in one tech that's maybe 10, 20 years old, and you replaced it with a new tech, a new programming language, a new infrastructure, but the code was almost exactly the same, would there be any benefit to that? Yes, there would be, because modern tech makes you more productive. So there would be a benefit, probably a big benefit, but would it solve all your problems and give you the maximum benefit? No way, because you still have all of that coupling. You still have the architecture designed for women's clothing that's supporting use cases that aren't women's clothing. So have to actually address the design issues of the architecture as well. So to do this well, I think it's important to focus on the value streams in our company. And what we mean by value streams is the different pipelines of work in our organization. So if the problem is the legacy system makes us slow, we need an architecture that helps us to do work faster, we have to think what kinds of work is being done in our company and how do we design an architecture that allows us to do that kind of work in the most effective way. And so I think these 4 principles are very useful. These are the 4 things that I'm always thinking about. If you focus on all 4 of these, I think you're much more likely to end up with a better architecture. So the first one is what I think about as being domain aligned. If we want to have a loosely coupled architecture, then we need to think about how would we shape our business into different areas, into different domains and subdomains. What's the kind of work, the different kinds of work we do as a company, and how do we think about that on a conceptual level? The second stage is all about the outcomes. It's about knowing for the different value streams in our organization, what are we optimizing for and what are we not optimizing for? Are we optimizing for growth, profitability, stability? Are we planning to move into new markets to support existing customers? Which are the key outcomes we're optimizing for? So we don't architect for things that that the business doesn't need from us. There's going to be a lot of effort and complexity that's just not needed there. Then we also have to think about the teams. If we want work to get done faster and we design a loosely coupled architecture that allows work to be done faster, Well, if we're putting loads of roadblocks and bottlenecks and bureaucracy in front of the teams, we can't really benefit from the architecture anyway. So we have to think very carefully, how do we empower the teams to actually leverage this loosely coupled architecture? And then finally, we have the software and the tech. Teams need to be able to make changes and deploy changes. Otherwise, again, there can be bottlenecks here that can negate all the benefits of a loosely coupled architecture if you've got a very poor developer experience. So a company that did this well is a company called ICE. They do copyright, royalties, sorry. They pay people who are owed royalties. So in the early days, as you can see on the top, my friend Casper works here. They built a system that I would say is quite common. The system grows organically. They've got these different systems that have bits of different logic mixed together. The systems have technical names like the import-export system. If you're a developer working on one of these, because there's lots of coupling and a lack of clear boundaries and things have grown organically, you have to understand lots of the code base to touch a small part of the code base. So larger teams, larger cognitive load, longer build, compile and testing, all those kind of problems. So Casper and his team and his colleagues, they applied those principles. They used concepts like DDD to map out the business, and they identified these subdomains like usage ingestion, royalty calculation, claims. So that was the business aspect. They allowed teams to build and deploy the software independently for each subdomain. And very interestingly, you can see some great examples up here, these two bullets here, of the kind of metrics you should be looking for. So at ICE, what they're trying to do is pay people who are owed royalties as quickly as possible. They were able to reduce the ingestion processing time by 80% and improve the matching process significantly. So these are the kind of key kind of outcomes that it's important to try and be aware of up front. What are you aiming for? Another thing to consider when thinking about the architecture and how to rewrite it and how to avoid complexity that will slow you down is to think about what's actually needed in the current system. Sometimes people think it's easy to just take the current system and make the new one support all of the current use cases the current one supports. But you almost certainly will end up spending a lot of time modernizing things that aren't needed or are more complex than needed. So you're wasting a lot of time. And as everyone knows, the longer modernization takes, the more people start to get worried and the more chance your modernization will not finish and you'll be in one of these halfway situations. A lot of companies have these architectures where they've got multiple failed modernizations, a lot of these halfway situations where people have to use 4 different tools because each of them was supposed to be the one solution to fix everything. So we want to really avoid not completing modernization. One of the people I work with at the moment, he's always saying this. He's like, which of these options will least likely end up with us having an incomplete or a partially complete modernization? He's been scarred so badly, he talks about that almost every single week. So interestingly, not sure how much we can trust this number, but Pendo are saying 80% of your system is not being used or is rarely being used. That's a lot of wasted modernization effort. If you can find out what the 80% of stuff not being used in your system is, you can save a lot of time and have an architecture that really does the minimum it needs to in the most elegant way and doesn't have lots of unneeded complexity that just slows you down. So when thinking about modernization, I think it's important to look outside of the software, outside of the current solution. And for me, I think there are four different levels. So we have the software and the infrastructure. Yes, we can modernize those. Yes, it will give us benefits. Not saying tech's not important, it's super important. But if we're going to spend all this time fixing some legacy systems, we might want to invest in the user journey. We might want to take this opportunity to improve the domain model. If we're Vinted and we have a domain model that's designed for women's clothing and all this other stuff built on top of it that's not women's clothing, we might decide, how can we design this domain model to support all of these different use cases in the most elegant way. It's a chance to improve language. I think over time, we all see this. You look at the legacy code, it has all these different words, and when people talk about your business and products, they're not using those words anymore. It's a chance, again, to reset the domain model and make sure that the language in your code is matching the language your business people use to talk about the business, and you talk about. So some different levels, and obviously the domain itself. Let's change how the business works. Maybe there are processes to automate. Maybe there are parts of the business that are inefficient. Maybe there are some Excel spreadsheets the developers don't know about that we could actually put into the software. Come back to that one later, I think. But here's a quick example. In 2016, I worked in the UK government, worked in the business property taxes area, and we were touching all of these different levels. On a software level, we were moving to domain-driven microservices, a big initiative. There was some awesome platform involved. But we also had user researchers in the team. Every sprint, they were going out, talking to real citizens, and preparing videos. And even the developers were going to these user research sessions. So as we were modernizing the software, we were always thinking about what could this do? What could be the optimal user journey? We can see what users are complaining about. We also had the chance to actually change how the domain worked. And in this case, if you're working for the government and you're changing some business processes, you might be changing the actual law itself. And we were. Some of these laws in the government had existed for decades. I'm sure someone said at one time some of the laws existed for more than 100 years. And we had the ability to change those. They were like, decades ago, 100 years ago, we didn't have software and the internet. How can we change how the government works, how the law works, to benefit from what's possible with technology nowadays? So I'm not saying you would do all of this for every part of your system. That would be very expensive. But it's always important to think about, for each part of your system, how much of each of these things makes sense. If you're just focusing everything on the software and not doing any of those things anywhere, yeah, definitely be a bit more broad in your focus, I would say. So if that's the mindset of a modern architecture modernization journey, I'll share with you some tools that I think are most useful in this respect, tools that I use, tools that are maybe not talked about so much elsewhere. So the first one is listening. Who's good at listening? Okay, if your hand's not up right now, you're not good at listening. So when I talk about listening, I mean not just being a good listener, but actually listening tours. One thing I found very useful over the last 3 or 4 years or so was actually, before you start talking about modernization, go and talk to lots of people in your company. Just try to understand what's important to them. And there's various benefits to doing this. Firstly, you understand what problems they're trying to solve, what issues they have. And then you can actually use that to shape your narrative. Rather than modernization being, we've got some legacy systems, we need to fix them, you know what problems people have, you know what they're trying to achieve, and you can say, we're going to make some improvements to the software to enable these ambitions you have. So it actually becomes a business-driven modernization. Modernization is just the enabler to give them what they want. You start with their needs. And the other thing I find very important about this is, as you start modernizing, as I talked about earlier, it's going to be all these issues. It's going to be all these big decisions. Do we build this new feature, or do we do some modernization work? That's going to be a constant tug of war to and fro, I think. And if you do these listening sessions, it's a great chance for you to build those relationships, for people to feel like he or she came and talked to me and listened to me. So when you're proposing an idea, they're much more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt, I think. It's about building that trust. But listening's not easy. Having these conversations isn't easy. It's definitely a skill you can improve, because you don't want to do this. Imagine you're meeting someone and you say to them, I'm not surprised you're so unproductive with the in-house CRM and all those spreadsheets. We will automate the processes and switch to Salesforce. This will be great, right? A lot of Salesforce cameos. Anything else we can do to help you? So what's great about this is, in the first sentence, in the first half a sentence, you just told someone they're unproductive. You told them the solution that they're using to get by in their job is unproductive and made it sound like a bad solution. They might have spent ages making this CRM and these spreadsheets all fit together with the constraints they're facing, and you've just told them their baby's ugly. Then you've told them the solution. We're going to automate your job. We're going to use Salesforce, and you've rubbed it in their face by saying that's great. And then you said anything else we can do to help you, even though the thing you just said doesn't help them. So this one is maybe a little bit exaggerated, but it's very easy to say these kind of things without realizing it. It's very easy to say, yeah, I've said a lot of stupid things like this and told people they're unproductive, or made them feel like the solution they're currently using wasn't very good, even though that was all they could do in the constraints. So I think, listening tours can be very useful, but it is important to try and think about how you phrase things. Personally, my approach, I just try and keep things open to begin with. Just let the conversation flow, normally letting them speak the most. In reality, I would say it's quite simple. What you want to understand is what's important to you. What problems do you have? What are your top priorities? Where would you like the company to be in the next 2 or 3 years? So you can word that in different ways, see where the conversation's going. And you can even do this in an organic way. The conversation might start, you say, how are you today? They might say, I'm having a great day, or they might say, I'm having an awful day, we've got an issue in production. And then you can say, oh, sorry to hear that. Do you have is production issues causing you a lot of pain at the moment? And they might say, yeah, we've had quite a few in the last 2 weeks. And you might say, oh, so that's the top problem for you to fix right now. And they might say, oh, no, we have this other problem that's even worse, but we don't have time to fix it. So you can get the answers and information you need in an organic way, in a natural way, without diving right in and saying, tell me your top 5 problems. So it feels a bit forced when you do that. Okay, so I think you can have these conversations with people. You can get a lot of useful insights. Different people might say different things, but at some point you need to know, okay, what are the key metrics and outcomes we're optimizing for? And that's where something a bit more structured can be useful. And for me, impact mapping or similar techniques are very useful in this respect. With an impact map, you can take a business objective. So you're having this conversation, and you might be talking to the chief marketing officer, and they might say to you, yeah, we have to add 20 million plus revenue in the next 3 years. So you can actually do this on the wall or on a Miro board and say, okay, so 20 million plus revenue, is that your top priority for the next 2 or 3 years? And they might say, yeah, if we achieve this, everyone's happy. If we don't achieve this, nothing else matters. And you're like, okay, great. Let's start with this one. What ideas do you have in mind for achieving this top level objective? And they might talk about different people who can help that. In this example here, it was the enterprise users. So what kind of improvements do we need through enterprise users? And the example here is around accuracy and improving lead times. If we can improve the accuracy of our software, if we can make our users more productive, then we'll get some benefits. And then you have your problem defined. As part of modernization, we have to help the company achieve these impacts. And so the red post-its are deliverables. Those are the things that you will modernize. So now you have a very clear link between here's a top-level company priority, and here's what you're modernizing. So if anyone ever says to you, why are you modernizing that? That's the 80% of the system that doesn't need modernizing. You can say, no, that's the 20% that does need modernizing. Reality is a bit more complex. Having this diagram's nice, but still it can be a bit more complex. But it's very useful to have this, I think, to have that clear link to form the basis of your narrative and your conversations. So the next tool is Wardley Mapping. You're probably going to hear more about this later from someone who's quite good with this technique. But it's very useful for modernization, and I'll share a quick story with you from recently. So basic idea is you start with your users, you start with your user needs, and then you map out the dependencies in your software for how you provide those needs. So the example here is you have a customer, they want to order some food without cooking, so you have a mobile app which uses a menu service, which connects to a payment system, it runs on a cloud platform. So you map out these dependencies, not that useful at this point, but then you put them on the Wardley map in these different stages of evolution. In brief, things towards the left-hand side of the Wardley map are more unknown, more opportunities for innovation. Things more to the right-hand side in commodity, they're boring and old, less innovation. So once you've done that, you can then start to have very sensible conversations like, well, if we're planning to innovate here as a company, we need to be able to innovate fast here. Loosely coupled architecture, empowered teams, all those things are important here. Over here, well, we just need to make the current systems run as cheaply as possible, maybe use some SaaS product or off-the-shelf tool, whatever it takes just to make it work. Maybe we want to make small changes here and there, but we don't need a huge amount of modernization there. But the caveat is, those can still be big modernization projects because the current systems might be so complex and expensive and fragile in production. So modernization can be anywhere in those places, but the focus of modernization is usually more towards innovation, speed, or stability and reducing costs. Importantly, with the Wardley map, it's not about the current state, the current position of your components. What's the most important thing is to think about how things are evolving. So on a Wardley map, everything evolves from left to right. And the question you need to be asking with your stakeholders is, for each piece of our system, for each part of our business, how quickly and why is something evolving? So an example of something evolving quickly would be, we just built this new feature, our customers love it, we've got a load of new signups and revenue from it, all our competitors are going to copy it as quickly as possible. In 1 year from now, all our competitors will have this. It won't be a big chance to innovate for us. It will have gone from left to right in 1 or 2 years. So when you're modernizing, you want to be thinking, where's the business going to be in 2 or 3 years? You know, it's always very difficult to predict the future, but by having these conversations, by thinking about components, we can start to be a bit more objective and less gut feel about things. So the story I was going to talk about was a company I was working with a few months ago. Let's move that mouse cursor. So we had this workshop of 3 days. On day 1, we mapped out the current states, and there were 2 things that they were really excited about. The first one is they had this legacy system. They wanted to modernize every aspect of it. And the second thing was, there's loads of cool AI stuff we want to do with the product. So they were going to modernize this whole legacy system and do this new AI stuff. We got to the Wardley mapping. I'll go back a couple of slides. So this group was developers, product people, designers, architects, a real mix of people. And then on the 3rd day, we did some Wardley mapping. So they mapped out their current system, and that legacy system I talked about, most of it was on the right-hand side over here. Most of the components were over here. And what we did is some role play. We said, so we had different groups who each did this independently, and we said each group, you have to present to the other groups who are going to be the CEO and approve or reject your modernization proposal. And when they did this, they were like, this whole legacy system they're going to completely remodernize. They were like, there's a few bits of that we want to modernize, but we're not going to touch all of the rest of it because we want to focus more over here on the AI stuff. So if you have a lot of legacy systems and people are like, oh, we're going to finally fix all of these old problems we've got, you might not be fixing all of those old problems. And a Wardley map is a way to make that a bit more objective and a way to make people realize, yeah, we have some legacy, we're going to fix bits of it, but not all of it, and there's a reason for that. So I think that the role play exercise is a good one in my opinion. Ask some developers or architects, use your Wardley map as a way to propose your architecture modernization, and someone role plays the CEO. So the next tool I think super useful is EventStorming, a couple of different flavors. Big picture EventStorming is a way to map out how your business currently works. So we talked earlier, where's that 80? It's always 80-20, isn't it? That's why I'm not sure about that number, but let's go with Pendo. So we want to figure out what's the 20% of our system that is being used and what's the 80% that's not being used. We can use a tool like EventStorming to get people together. This room would be amazing for EventStorming. You'll get 10, 15, 20 people, maybe even more, and you'll map out part of your business on the wall as a timeline, and then you can start to have lots of conversations about what's working well, what do we keep, what do we change. You can say things like, when I look at the code, we have a big module that does all of this stuff, but I'm not seeing anything about that on the EventStorm. Maybe someone's missing from the workshop. Maybe people have forgot about that thing and it is being used, or maybe it's not being used anymore. But the EventStorming can help you to have those conversations to figure out what's needed and what's working. Process modeling EventStorming is a great tool for mapping out the future state. So with big picture, you can map out the current states, and with process modeling, you can work together in a group, different stakeholders, and map out how the business should work. So I would say it's more about how the business will work, how the domain will work. So I guess with the example with Vinted, they might map out the current state and realize there's lots of things about women's clothing here. And with the future states, how would we design this process, this business process that is optimal for all of the use cases and not just women's clothing? EventStorming is also a great way to actually start shaping your architecture. I talked about the domain-aligned component principle, which I think is very important. If you're doing EventStorming, you build this timeline. Imagine this wall here is covered in orange Post-it notes. That's your business on the wall. You can then go through the wall and just say, which bits of this feel related? How do we cluster these different domain events into different areas? And that becomes the template for your architecture. In this example here, we have a boring e-commerce example, search and browse, cart and checkout, ordering. Just to give you the idea, in your domain it can be anything, but the point is, with the business mapped out, the domain events in an EventStorm, those are the facts, right? That's how your business works. This isn't, then you have to decide, how do we structure this? So the facts are the processes, that's just how things currently work. That's not that subjective. And then you can start designing with those facts laid out. The fifth tool, I think, or tool in this area, is about being able to choose what's the optimal level of investment in each part of our system, as I talked about before. So Wardley Mapping will give you some sense of what's the business value of each part of our system. You then have to decide what's the correct amount of modernization and what kind of modernization do we need. And there's two aspects, I think. So the first one, as we talked about earlier, is the technology. How much of the tech do we modernize for each part of the system? Maybe in some places we're happy to do lift and shift. Maybe in other places we're not. Are we changing the database, the programming language, runtime, libraries, integration frameworks? How much of that stuff do we change? And then across the bottom, we have how much of the software's design and functionality do we change? Are we changing the domain model? We're rewriting the whole thing? Or maybe we're in a situation where we have some legacy and it works, we don't want to get rid of it, but there's some data in there we need. So we might do something like a legacy encapsulate. We take some old legacy, we put an API on it, or we publish an event from it, and that's all we need. So this helps us to be very clear up front, what level of effort do we need in each area across those different axes. So just one final topic to talk about. So this is more around the, like I said, the project side of things. Getting started, always very difficult, and keeping modernization moving, even harder. So a couple of things I wanted to clarify first. I talked about EventStorming. I talked about this great technique where you get in a room for 5 days and map out your whole business with all these Post-its. It is time consuming, and I'm not saying you have to do this for all of your business before you start modernizing. That's probably too much upfront discovery. What I actually do recommend is trying to deliver something in the first 3 to 6 months. Because for me, there usually is something. It might not be the most important part of your system, but you know that thing will need to be modernized. There is some value in doing that now. And the reason I think this is important is because whenever I see companies modernizing, a lot of people still have the mindset of, I don't believe in this modernization. I don't think it will be successful. It will never happen. It won't work out. It will stop halfway through. As soon as you deliver something, those people start to change their mind and realize, oh, wow, actually, it is serious this time. It can take a long time to actually convince some people to actually care about modernizing. So delivering is one of the best ways to start changing that mindset. And also learning about where the complexity is in your system, how difficult it is to modernize different parts of your system. So for me, 3 to 6 months is possible in most companies. If you disagree, I'm happy to hear about your unique scenarios. You might be right, but I think as a challenge, it's always important to ask yourself, what is stopping us modernizing something in the first 3 to 6 months? So if you're in this situation where you're about to start modernizing, or you want to start modernizing, or it's not quite getting things moving, one thing I found very useful, about to choke. One thing I found very useful is these kind of Kickstarter workshops. The idea is we bring people together for 3 to 5 days in person. I do think for this kind of workshop, you want to have a lot of difficult conversations, you want to make some decisions. Being in person does make a big difference, I would say. Not 100% necessary, but if you can do it in person, I think in person makes a huge difference. And the idea is you want to try and come out of this with a plan of next steps as close as possible to being able to start modernizing. So the typical structure is workshop kicks off on day one, talking about the business goals, the product vision, what are the key things we're optimizing for. Then we do some EventStorming to map out the current states, discuss what's working well, what's not working. Then we can use process modeling to design the future states. Once we have the future state of the business, we can then say, now let's think about the architecture. How do we design the architecture for the new business requirements we have, or business vision we have from the process modeling? We can also talk about teams and ways of working. What does it mean to be a good team in this company? How do we want to work moving forward? And one thing I found very useful actually was in this workshop in Canada last year, the CTO said to me, he said to me and my friend Eduardo, who did the workshop, he said, I know you're going to talk about improving how teams work, but he said, could you give them a chance to talk about what's currently working well and not make them feel bad about what they're currently doing? I wasn't going to do that anyway. I don't try and make people feel bad, but he made a very good point. So what we did was, I think those green ones you can see there, at the start of the workshop, we just said, before we talk about how we want teams to work and how we want the company to change, everybody comes up to the front of the room, takes a green Post-it, and you put it on the wall and say, what's one thing you want to keep? So everyone came up, release process, collaborating. People had different things they wanted to keep. But that moment was, wow, I could really feel like this is actually having a big impact. People had some real concerns, like this modernization is going to take things away that are working. So if you do this kind of workshop, I would say having a moment for people to say what they want to keep, a massive moment here. So I would recommend doing that. And then finally, as I talked about, once you have this architecture, really, for me, trying to get as close as you can to, once this workshop finishes, how can we get as close as possible to being able to start working on this when we go back to work tomorrow or next week? It might not be a fully fleshed out roadmap, but some concrete steps and some owners, and maybe even, some actual technical tasks that people can start working on, trying to get as close as possible to actually doing this work. I think the concern is always have the workshops, do the EventStorming, lots of ideas, and then nothing happens. It's all too high level. So really focusing on trying to get something very concrete and something you can put in your backlog and start working on, get as close as you can. I don't have the words or the body language to explain how important I feel that is. This workshop was in Canada last year. It was amazing. We had 60 people. That's quite a large number. You don't need 60 people. Probably not for your first workshop either. We kind of organized it for 20 people, and every week it would be like, can 5 more people come? no, but okay, fine. Yeah, okay. And then it became 60 people. I think it was like 40 people the week before the workshop, and there was a big flurry at the end. So we had to make that work, but we got this whole office floor basically. So what you can see here is we have this event storm, and you can see we've got a lot of wall space here, a huge amount of wall space, and across the top you can see those yellow strips. So those are the different domains and subdomains in the company. And what's really important here is that we had sales and marketing and product and data science. We had all these different perspectives on how the business works and what the domains should be. All right, everyone was there in the room. We made this agreement. It's not final and 100% perfect, but we got a lot of alignment and clarity and a good starting point to work with. This was also where we found out that the sales team had an 80-step manual process all in spreadsheets, and no developers knew about that. So again, that's one of those things I was talking about. There's a lot of things to try and find in these workshops. So as I was saying, the workshop's very important. A lot of great things can happen in these workshops. For me, the workshop itself can be a real change in mindset. Like I was saying earlier, when you start modernizing, people have this, they're used to the old ways of working. They might not believe in modernization. In this workshop, some of the things people said were, wow, we've never done this before. Product and tech and marketing all in the same room doing EventStorming. Just that was enough to make people feel like this is different this time. Maybe this is the CTO who will lead to some changes, or maybe he'll be gone in 6 months. But at least it gave people some hope and optimism that maybe he could be the one who's going to change things. So yeah, the workshops, how do you keep things moving after the workshop? So, as I talked about, this change in mindset, it's not going to happen by itself. So you need to think about how do we put structures and support in place to help with this transition, to support modernization, to keep things moving. One of the techniques I've seen is something that we call the architecture modernization enabling team. You might have seen this by other names or things very similar. It's not a big, exciting new invention. But the idea is you have this team that's focused on modernization. They don't do the modernization work. They don't tell people what modernization work to do, but their job is to identify where's modernization getting stuck, what help the teams need. It might be a prioritization issue. It might be, well, the teams are being told to modernize from the CTO, and they're also being told to do product work by the chief product officer. The teams can't solve this problem themselves. This enabling team can actually get in there and try and solve that problem. Or maybe the team doesn't have the skills to do event-storming sessions, or maybe the team doesn't know how to design an architecture in a domain-driven way. So an architecture modernization enabling team is about building these skills, setting up the system so that modernization can happen, so that even when the architecture modernization enabling team steps away, modernization will keep working. And I would say one of the most important things in an AMET is having people who are not just good at architecture, but also have an enabling mindset. I've worked with a lot of smart people, and if they're in a workshop or a team is struggling, they will say, here's a solution, go build this. But if you work in an architecture modernization enabling team, you have to think, how can we solve this problem in a way that when I'm not here anymore, this team can solve the problem themselves? And I think that real enabling coaching mindset is very difficult. You need to be patient. So I think that's the most important skill in these teams. And probably the listening as well, being able to talk to different stakeholders and talk different languages. You might not use an AMET, you might use something different, but I think those qualities, that mindset is important regardless of the people who are actually doing this. So that's basically it. I'll quickly wrap things up. So I think it's inevitable that as companies become successful, they build up a legacy. Even if you make good decisions, the business strategy changes, the environment changes, the world changes, and the software that was perfect one day, it's not perfect anymore, even if it's nothing that you could control. So modernization is really, how can we be a successful company and still innovate quickly? We need an architecture that lets us get work done as if we were building the system from day one. It's more than just tech, but the tech is important. I don't want to try and create this sense of ignore the tech, just do all this DDD stuff. Both things are important. I'm not saying one's more important than the other. I'm saying have to be thinking what's the right tech stack, how do we use tech effectively, and also how do we design a system, what patterns and techniques do we use to design it. Both things are important. Then I talked about these 5 different techniques. There's lots of other techniques, lots of other things that are important, but I think these ones are things that I see talked about less often, so I thought I would talk about these to try and put them on your radar, because they might not have been there already. And then finally, for most companies, except OpenTable, modernization will be a long journey. You've got to try and think, how do we even get this thing started? It's going to be very difficult to go from ideas to actually modernizing. So trying to deliver something in the first 3 to 6 months, highly recommended. Kickstarter workshops can also be very useful. Get people together, get people excited, make some decisions, make some discoveries, and then you need to be able to use that momentum and keep things moving. And that's where you need some group of people who are going to be responsible for focusing on making sure modernization keeps moving. Think about all the scenarios where modernization might get stuck. Priorities, teams clashing, team not having the skills. Who in your company is going to identify those problems and fix them? That's everything. Thank you.